from now. So I have a new book. It's called A New Contract with the Middle Class. It's co-authored with a brilliant senior researcher at Brookings named Richard Reeves. He served as the top aide to the coalition government in the UK. He's married to an American, and so she'd spent a lot of time in the UK, and now it's her turn to spend time in the US. And one of the results of that is that we got him to come to Brookings, and I feel very privileged to get to work with him. So what is the new contract with the middle class is to some extent, a policy book. You could think of it, if you like, as what we think a new president should do. We don't have any illusions. Brookings is very nonpartisan, and we like to think of ourselves as moderates, but we don't have any illusions that Trump would ever adopt our agenda. But we do think there are ideas in it that will appeal to people who are right of center as well as left of center. So that's sort of the context. Now, why? Well, first of all, who is the middle class? There are lots of definitions of the middle class, and if you do a survey and ask Americans what they are, they will almost all of them tell you that they are middle class. We like to think of ourselves as middle class. We like to think of ourselves as a middle class country, a country that doesn't have a landed or property aristocracy, or an establishment that's all based on who your family was. We also don't like to think of ourselves as being dependent on government assistance. We like to be independent and self-sufficient and self-respecting. And those are all sort of middle class values. But in order to do analysis and to be a little bit more specific, we needed an actual definition that would enable us to run numbers and so forth. So we decided to take the middle 60% of the population by income, by household income. That covers people who have incomes as low as $40,000 a year, and people who have incomes as high as $150,000 a year. But it does not include people below 40 or above 150. That's going to be important because I am going to tell you about a little bit of analysis we did on what's been happening to this group. So what do we care about? What do we want to know about the middle class? And we thought a lot about what it means to have a decent quality of life. What do people want? And based on both the research and to some extent your common sense, we came up with sort of 5 elements or 5 foundations for having a good life. One is money. Another is time. Do you have enough time? The third is relationships with your family, but also relationships with friends and with your community. Georgetown Village is a community, and this organization is a subgroup within that community. And so those are relationships that matter. And why do we think it's important to be looking at the middle class? I mean, a lot of people would say, well, why aren't you looking at the poor? Aren't they doing a lot worse? And of course they are. But we think it's important to look at the middle class because they're a large group. And if you don't have a strong middle class, you're not going to have a flourishing democracy. You're also not going to have a strong economy. That's where most of your purchasing power is. And you're certainly not going to have a sense of community or any sense of social solidarity. So we thought it was important to look at this group. We've been doing so for a couple of years. This book is just the tip of the iceberg of the work we've done. And we are at the same time sensitive to the issue of poverty. So we make sure that when we come up with a policy solution, that in general, that policy solution is going to be aimed at the middle class, but it's not going to hurt the poor. It's sort of a do no harm principle. Now, in addition to the do no harm to the poor principle, we have some other principles. I'll mention four. One is what we call partnerships. And by that, we mean that we are not going to argue that everything should be done for the middle class. We're talking about a new contract with the middle class. In other words, we want citizens to be good citizens and behave in responsible ways, but at the same time, we think government owes them certain ways of certain kinds of help that will make their the American dream, a reality. So let me give you an example that's a key part of our book. We say we are going to have scholarships for service. Scholarships for service is our shorthand for everybody should get 2 years of free college or technical training of some kind. Doesn't have to be liberal arts college. It could be learning how to be a software engineer or whatever. But you don't get that free tuition to go to college unless you've done 1 year of national service through an organization like AmeriCorps, which is our current major voluntary agency. So there's a quid pro quo there. It's a conditional entitlement, but it also represents our principle of partnership. You help your country, you show your citizenship by working in a local community organization, like helping on the environment, helping the poor, teaching children, working with in a natural disaster, whatever. And in return, we give you this college experience. Another way to think about that, by the way, is instead of K through 12 being publicly supported, we've always been in favor of K through 12. Nobody ever questions the idea that K through 12 should be publicly funded. Of course, people have the option to go to private school, but they have a clear entitlement to a K through 12 public education. And we're sort of arguing that in today's world, K through 12 isn't enough. You need K through 14. So we're trying to replace K through 12 with the idea of K through 14. But we want to move to it gradually, and we do want to require service in response. Let me talk a little bit now about each of the 5 foundations of a good life. And I'll try to be brief because I really want to open this up for discussion. I just want to give you all kind of the flavor of what I've been working on and arguing for. On the money front, how is the middle class doing? The answer is not well. To be specific, when we look at the growth of people's incomes, their family or household incomes, over the last 4 decades, since about 1979 or 80, what we find is that the growth of middle class incomes has been very slight. Their incomes have grown, but not by very much. The second thing is that those incomes have not grown as rapidly as they have for the rich, by which I mean the top 20% of the income distribution. That won't surprise you, I'm sure. We've all read about inequality and that the rich are doing better. But what may surprise you is that their middle class incomes are not growing as fast as incomes in the bottom 20% either. Now, one thing you need to know to understand that is that we measure income by taking out taxes and by adding in any government benefit that somebody gets. And one of the reasons the bottom 20% is doing better than the middle class is because they don't pay any taxes. In fact, they get tax credits, and they get free health care through Medicaid. And that's worth a lot. So if you add in the value of things like Medicaid and food stamps and the earned income tax credit and some other programs like that, then we see pretty good growth in the bottom 20%. Not as high as for the top 20%, but considerably higher than for this middle 60%. So the middle 60% is kind of stuck in this category where they don't get a lot of help from the government. They do pay quite a bit in taxes, especially payroll taxes. They are experiencing stagnant wages. At least the men are, the men in the middle class. Though for women, it's a different story. Amongst women, what we find is that their employment and their wages are both growing. And in fact, virtually all of any increase in middle class incomes over the last 4 decades was due to just one thing. And that is the fact that more of them now have 2 earners and that women are doing better in the labor market. If you imagined a world in which women hadn't entered the labor force and weren't earning more, middle class incomes adjusted for inflation and after taxes and government benefits would be exactly where they were back in 1979. So all of the growth of the middle class well-being, at least in money terms, is due to women's increased contributions to the family. Let's go from money to time. Based on what I just told you, there's clearly been a money squeeze on the middle class. They're feeling anxious. They are feeling stretched. They are feeling just one paycheck away from being in deep trouble. And by the way, we've done a lot of qualitative work. We've gone out and actually talked to the middle class in 5 different areas of the United States and listened to their voices and listened to their stories. And they will tell you about how squeezed they feel for money and how they are living paycheck to paycheck. So that has, and then I told you this story about the only reason they've made any gains at all is because of women's contributions. But guess what? That creates a time squeeze. If everybody in the family, and it's true of 70% of middle-class families, have everybody that they can in the labor force, there's nobody at home to take care of the kids and do the housework and all the other things that women traditionally have done and are still traditionally doing, not quite as much as they used to. There's more sharing of all of that now that women are working for pay, but there's not nearly as much sharing as there should be, given how much work women have taken on. And of course, we have a lot more single parent families, and they are the sole breadwinners for their families. So if we count up all the families in which I'm going to talk about parents now, where the mother is the sole breadwinner for the family, or I'm sorry, I said it wrong. Either the sole breadwinner or the primary breadwinner if it's a 2-earner family. Guess how many people that is? It's 40% of all women who are parents are either the sole breadwinner or the primary breadwinner for their family. So, I tell you that because I think we all have this image in which, men are thought of as the primary breadwinners, and they aren't anymore. They still are a slight majority, but only a slight majority. That's creating what we call a time squeeze. So I told you that another foundation for a good life is whether you have enough time to do everything you want to do. And we just heard story after story from the people we interviewed about how they don't have enough time, and the women in particular feel very stretched for time. And like they're doing 3 jobs, one in the labor market, one at home, and another one to take care of everything else that we all have to do in our lives. So that leads to a policy discussion of things like paid leave. And right now, the U.S. is the only country, almost the only country in the world, and definitely the only rich country, the only advanced country, that doesn't have a national paid leave policy. So we argue that in light of this time squeeze, we should give everyone 20 days of time off with pay every year for any reason. Now, people who work for big corporations and people who are in professional jobs, they already get that. It's mainly people that are in occupations that are further down in the ranks that are not. So that's why we think we need to follow most of the European countries, virtually all of the European countries, in guaranteeing some paid time off with pay. I mean, the COVID emergency has obviously brought this to the fore. How are you supposed to supervise your children who are doing online work for school, hold down a full-time job, and do everything else in the household? It's really very difficult. So I could get more into all of that if you're interested. One statistic I want to leave with you to really bring home this question of the time squeeze is we did some data crunching, and we discovered, and this surprised even me because I thought I already knew a lot about this, right now, compared to 1975, the typical middle-class family in America is putting in an extra day and a half per week, a day and a half every week, in order to keep their income growing a little bit. And that has to do, that's the combined hours of the parents in the family. And it's not that the hours of any one individual have gone up, it's that more people in the family are working. All right, relationships. Lynn mentioned at the beginning that one of my earlier books was on the family, and that the last time I think I spoke to this group, it was about that book. It was called Generation Unbound, Drifting into Sex and Parenthood Without Marriage. And it was about the breakdown of the American family, especially the decline in marriage and the increase in single parenthood and in children being born outside of marriage. So we revisited that in this book, in the chapter that we did on relationships, family relationships, and we see a continuing decline in marriage, including in the middle class. A lot of people think that having children outside of marriage is something that only the poor do. That used to be true. It isn't anymore. Now it is the middle class that is just as involved as lower income families in having children outside of marriage. What we did find is that a lot of those children are being born now to cohabiting couples. I'm guessing that if any of you are like me, you may know someone or may even have a child or a grandchild yourself who is having is in a cohabiting relationship and is having children. But the point is that a very large proportion of children now, even in the middle class, are born outside of marriage. What do we do about that? Well, there are a lot of people who say we need to bring back marriage. We need churches and community organizations and maybe even some programs, government programs themselves. We had some during the Bush administration, marriage education programs, to try to encourage people to get married, especially if they're going to have children. And none of those programs have worked very well. In fact, they've kind of been a failure, according to the evidence on what works. And as a result of that, even though I actually believe and argued in my last book on this, that marriage is, that growing up in a two-parent married family is much better for kids. We know that they do better. I'm getting quite pessimistic about whether we can bring marriage back as the sort of standard, typical way to raise children. It just seems to be disappearing. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, those cohabiting couples, they're going to get married. They just haven't gotten married yet. And you're right, a lot of them will, about half of them will, but a lot of them won't. And the difference between raising a child in a cohabiting relationship as opposed to in a married relationship is cohabiting relationships are much more unstable. A lot of them will break up before a child is age 5. And so we can get back into all that family stuff if you're interested. We also looked at relationships with friends and relationships in your community. We couldn't find any evidence that there's more loneliness than there used to be, although there's a bit of evidence that maybe amongst people our age, the elderly, loneliness is growing. More of us live alone. There are fewer extended families than there used to be. Places like Georgetown Village have a new role to play, as I'm sure Lynn could say. That's like, David Brooks wrote a cover story for the Atlantic magazine in which he talked about this, and he talked about all the stuff I talked about in my book about the decline in the nuclear family. And he too said, well, what's the solution? And he argued that the solution was what he called families of choice or forged families. So Georgetown Village is a little bit like a family of choice, a group that has gotten together and decided to be supportive of each other because our children are not nearby, or because we're alone, or for other reasons. I could go on about relationships, but let me skip to health. Everybody's talking about health these days. And obviously health is a very important ingredient of one's quality of life. And as we get older, we recognize that especially, and value that especially if we still have good health. The thing we worry about in our book is that everyone is talking about health care, and not enough people are talking about health, meaning health outcomes. And it turns out when you look at all of the research on health, that your individual behaviors and your economic and social circumstances are 3 times as important in determining your health, how healthy you are, as is healthcare. So obviously healthcare is important. Obviously it contributes to good health, but it is a minor factor contributing to health. And we need to put a lot more emphasis on what people need to do, or what we need to do as a society to create better health. Poverty, for example, is a big determinant of health. The poor are obviously in worse health. I think we all know that, but that's not just because they don't get health care. As I mentioned earlier, they do tend to get health care. It's because of all kinds of other stresses and problems in their lives. Maybe it's their housing. Maybe it's the kind of job they work at. Maybe it's because they are facing the stresses of being a single parent or whatever. But that's true across the board. So what can we do to get better health? Well, that's a huge topic, and we can't get into it either today, and we couldn't even get into it in a fulsome way in our book. But one of the things we talk about is where the trends are worse. Health in the U.S. is actually going down. Our health is not getting better. It's getting worse. The best metric or indicator of that is that our longevity has actually been declining recently. And when you compare the U.S. to other advanced countries, we look terrible. We are number 27 out of the 34 OECD countries in terms of life expectancy. So, and a lot of the reason why our longevity is declining, our life expectancy is declining, is because of what has been called deaths of despair. Some of you may have read about this. It's research that was done by two people at Princeton, and they are finding that people in prime age, I'm talking about people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and mostly white, and mostly living in rural areas, their mortality rate is going up. Their longevity is going down. They're dying of drug overdoses. That's to some extent the opioid crisis. They're dying of suicide. They're dying of alcoholism. So this is a new thing in the U.S. And it's not good. The other big trend is in obesity. I'm sure you've all read about that, and the trends are really quite shockingly bad. And way too many of us are obese, and I'm sure you know, but actually maybe you don't, because I didn't know enough about this until we got into this. Obesity is a very big risk factor for everything from cardiovascular disease to cancer to diabetes and so forth and so on. And so we have to worry about it. And in case you're thinking, well, this is, nothing we can do about, because all of us have tried going on diets, and speaking for myself, I find it impossible. I lose a little weight and then I gain it right back again. Well, what we suggest is something that's actually been shown to work, which is put a tax on sugary beverages. Sugary beverages, it turns out, and I didn't know this until I got into this either, sugary beverages are a huge culprit in obesity. And it does help to cut back on consumption of them when you tax them more, the same way we tax cigarettes and alcohol, because they're not good for us. And obesity creates hugely higher healthcare costs in the US. So we would actually save money if we could figure out a way to help people get do healthier eating and many other, and exercise and all that, you know that. I'm going to finally talk a little bit about respect, because that's another foundation of a good life. You need to feel respected. And there are too many people in our society that don't feel respected. Women don't feel as respected as men. African Americans don't feel as respected as whites. And we have an interesting chapter about all of that. And we not only talk about the need for people to respect each other, all of us to respect one another, but we also talk about the need to respect your government. And right now, trust in government in the US is at an all-time low. And so people are alienated. They don't any longer believe in democracy. The proportion of millennials who think that democracy is the best form of government is down to about half. Think about that. Only about half of young people think democracy is the best form of government. But what's driving all of that? What's driving that is the fact that the social contract with the middle class in America is broken. We have not been responsive to people's real needs, whether it's for, time off from work or a little more income or a little more help with health care or something else. And so that's a big, complicated topic. I think I'll leave it at that and stop now and see what else you all might want to talk about.
Well, thank you very much. You've certainly given us a lot to think and talk about. I am going to ask people, if you have a question, to please unmute your mic. You should be able to do that. If not, raise your hand and I will try to help you unmute. But I know that there's been a lot of thoughts, and I myself have some thoughts, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to ask questions first. So I see, Brenda, you have your hand up and you're unmuted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was an interesting discussion. And I've been following the series that that Brookings has been posted. So I've been reading about this to a smaller degree. I did read Richard Reeves' book, Dream Hoarders. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was particularly striking in the sense that he sort of made the point that a lot of the policy decisions made in the last 30 years benefited the upper middle class. Things like the mortgage interest deduction, 401k plans, 529 plans, things like that. I'm curious to know why you took the middle 60%, because I would think that some of those folks fall into Richard Reeves' Dream Hoarders group and some do not.
Well, when Richard was working on that book, most of his data was on the top 20%. That's how he defined a dream hoarder. They were really upper middle class people. And so I think that, that's still an interesting issue. That book has gotten a lot of great attention. He wrote an op-ed that was in the New York Times
I read it. Yes.
About a week ago, maybe, on the SALT deduction, the state and local tax deduction, which mainly helps the dream hoarders, the top 20%. And so he says, maybe we shouldn't be getting rid of what was done in 2017 to cap it, because Vice President Biden has been talking, and others in the Democratic Party have been talking about uncapping it so people get a bigger deduction for their state and local taxes and therefore pay less federal tax. So,
but I'm curious to know what kind of federal policy actions, other than this 2 years of additional schooling, that you feel would be helpful.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. No, you're right. I skipped over our biggest proposal there, and it's my fault. I won't bore you with what I've been doing the rest of today, but I'm feeling a little disorganized. Our biggest proposal, in addition to the scholarships for service, is we eliminate income taxes for the middle class. Now, how can we do that? Let me explain, because this is really fun and interesting, I think. We do that by increasing the standard deduction a lot. We increase it to $100,000 a year for a couple.
Wow.
$50,000 if you're an individual. So if you make less than $100,000 a year as a couple, you pay no income tax. Now you're immediately going to say to yourselves, as we did, well, how can you do that? Don't we need that revenue to pay for all kinds of things? And the answer is yes, of course we need that revenue to pay for all kinds of things we're already paying for, and also some new things that will cost money. So what we say is, well, we're going to have to raise taxes on that top 20%. And so we do. We get rid of the mortgage interest deduction, and we get rid of all of those deductions that mainly affect the upper middle class. And a lot of you might not like that, because if you're like me, you benefit from all those things. But we think, Richard and I think, that that group can afford to pay a little more. But that only makes up a small portion of the revenue we gave up by raising the standard deduction. So what else do we do? What else we do is really, really key. We say, let's not tax earnings from work, which is what income in the middle class is mostly about. They don't get much income in the form of interest, dividends, etc. It's income from work, it's earnings. So instead of taxing work, let's tax things that we don't want, like carbon, like consumption. And also, let's tax capital more. You know, the data are very clear that if you look at what's happening to national income in America, more and more of it is flowing to capital and less of it to workers, to
Yes.
labor.
Yeah,
So,
there's a strong case for taxing unearned income as earned income.
right.
Very strong case for that.
Yeah. So that's what we do, and you know that does help the middle class a lot. You know,
Do you have any thoughts?
I love the way a law professor at Yale put it. He said, April 15th for most people would just be another spring day.
Do you have any thoughts on a value-added tax?
Yes, well, when I say we tax consumption, that's exactly how we tax it. So yes, we have a big VAT. All the European countries have VATs. And we do worry about the regressivity of the VAT, you know, that it does hurt poor families. So we have, we use some of the revenues we collect with the VAT to make a rebate to the poor.
The way most European countries do.
Exactly. So that goes back to my principle of no harm to the poor in the process of helping the middle class.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Sounds
questions.
interesting.
And Richard will be thrilled that you read Dream Hoarders and were able to cite stuff from it. I'm going to tell him the next time I see him.
Well, I'm definitely going to read this book the two of you wrote.
By the way, this book is going to be, the electronic version of it anyway, is going to be available for free on Amazon on about October 6th or 7th.
Nice.
Terrific.
Next week. You can also read it on the Brookings website. You can also order a physical copy if you want by going on the Brookings website and putting in your home address. It's a little tiny book. I showed it to, it's very short. You can read it in about 2 hours, maybe less if you're a fast reader. And we didn't want to bore people with a lot of academic stuff, so we don't. But there's a lot of academic stuff that lies behind it.
Very interesting. I know we have a few more questions. Hans, I think you had a question.
Yes, I want to latch on to the last thing you mentioned. First of all, I really enjoyed your talk. It was very good. I sympathize with many of the things you do and support your suggestions. Now, one suggestion you had was we'll have to tax more. Obviously, if you want to shift money from one group to another, you have to tax. My question is, how do you prevent the lobbyists from preventing this to happen?
So now you're into, is this politically feasible? And we're well aware that it may not be and probably wouldn't be in normal times. After all, there have been proposals to tax carbon, lots of proposals to tax carbon, also proposals for a VAT, and also proposals to tax capital or wealth more. They haven't happened, right? So, good question. First of all, we said if we just stick with what's been politically feasible in the last, decade or two, it'll be a really boring book. And it's not the role of those of us who are scholars at Brookings to worry so much about what's politically feasible. Second, and I think even more important, we say, if not now, when? In other words, I go back to the fact that we may be at an inflection point because of what's been happening as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the recession, as a result of the fact that people are so fed up with their government. And that because of Trump, idiosyncratic that he is, there might be a big swing politically towards a more activist government. Somebody asked me yesterday, are we what they called Blair Clinton Democrats? And as Lynn said earlier on, I was in the Clinton administration, so I'm a moderate. And my co-author was also in a moderate government in the UK. So yes, we're moderates, but what we also have figured out amongst ourselves is that because the world has changed, and because there's so much distrust of government, and because democracy itself is on trial now, we need to do something bolder. And it's time for a more activist government. Perhaps we're at a new period like the Progressive Era or like the New Deal. And you can give it a name. I haven't given it one, but I would welcome your thoughts on one. And it might not happen, but we think the door is open for it to happen. And we want some good, bold, sensible, well-evaluated, well-researched ideas out there to walk through the door if it should open.
I agree with you, and I hope you're right.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Hans. Are there other questions? I thought I saw, yes. Tony, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
There.
Okay.
Okay. I too. First, I wanted to thank you for doing this, Val. That was
My pleasure, Tony. My pleasure.
really, really interesting, and I loved the presentation you did a few years ago on unwanted pregnancies and that important issue. I just wondered, in view of the fact that we are very interested in Georgetown Village's role, if you could go back to the relationships, that pillar, and develop a little further what your contract recommendation was in that area.
Yes. Well, one of our recommendations there is national service, because that will provide resources and staffing for a lot of nonprofits. And they need that and they value that. And many of the best known and biggest nonprofits in America rely heavily on AmeriCorps volunteers. I didn't know that until I started studying this. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post on national service with a guy named John Bridgeland. And interestingly enough, there is now legislation that's bipartisan to provide more funding and therefore more slots for young people to serve as volunteers. And so I'll ask Lynn to speak to whether she's ever used AmeriCorps volunteers. I don't know. But the other thing I'll mention is that I wrote a whole paper, separate from this short book, that's on what we call social capital, meaning, how strong are ties within a community? How are community organizations doing? How do we strengthen them? Other ways to strengthen them, other than through national service, is to provide deductions for charitable giving. we could enhance that. And the final thing that I've suggested is giving a little more power and authority to local governments. If we want to rebuild local leadership, we have to rebuild both local governments and local nonprofits. And so, Lynn, I don't know, maybe you have thoughts about that.
Oh, absolutely. So we have not worked with AmeriCorps just because we are too small, honestly. They look to work with bigger nonprofits.
Yeah.
At one point, Village to Village Network tried to form a relationship, figuring they were a bigger organization and they would be able to kind of lead the volunteers to individual villages. But AmeriCorps really does look to work with bigger organizations, even than Village to Village Network. I think you're right about the social capital and getting tax credits. I think that there's often a disregard for the value of the services the nonprofits give. Clearly, this isn't something I need to talk to you about, but, on my soapbox is the fact that we're not given the credit for the amount of money that we save governmental organizations. I think if you were to examine what the services are that we're providing that are not draining city services, you would find that there is a huge savings to the city budget, and we do try to make this argument when we ask for our grants, in terms of the savings of villages are providing by the volunteer services. There is not a dollar and cents value placed on the volunteers as there should be.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And let me mention that there is one academically respectable benefit cost analysis of national service, and it does try to take into account the money that's being saved or the value of the services being provided. And depending on which version you look at, the benefits to costs are at least 2 to 1 and probably more like 4 to 1.
Right, absolutely. And by the way, the other thing I just want to say is when you speak about the villages before, and I love the fact that you likened us to a family in that we're providing services and supporting each other. I think you used the phrase forced family, and I prefer to think of the village as a chosen family.
Oh, it's forged, F-O-R-G-E-D.
Oh, forged, thank
Forged.
you. Okay.
Sorry, but I'm glad you said that because I would never be in favor of forced families.
I was going to say, I think that we prefer to think of ourselves as a chosen family.
Absolutely, families of choice, of course.
Absolutely, thank you.
So glad you raised that. I'm going to have to be careful about enunciating that more carefully in the future. By the way, because this book isn't quite out yet, I'm not practiced yet at what to talk about and how to talk about it. So you all are being very indulgent of me today and appreciate that.
Well, we appreciate you spending the time and allowing us the opportunity to be one of your first audiences and be the first to hear about this. That's really a very nice opportunity for us. And as a village, I know we were very excited that you agreed to give this talk and to join us again because your last talk was so very well received. I thought I saw a few other hands before we let you off the hook. Ed, yes, I do see you. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay, I just did.
Thank you.
3 things that I'd offer or like to hear your comments on. One is in terms of the increased revenue needed to achieve your policy goals. I mean, certainly reversing the recent cut of the federal income tax at the highest levels is an elementary thing that just seems more than called for. Second thought is you're talking about eliminating federal income tax for basically couples making up to $100,000 a year. I've heard expressed the concept that there is some value in a broad range of citizens paying at least some taxes to sort of contribute to the operation of the government and give people a stake. And then a third thing I'd like to hear your comment on. I mean, to me, I think the capital gains taxes are way too low, but it does seem legitimate to factor in the risk that people take when they invest money in whatever kind of enterprise. So those are three things I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Great questions. On raising rates back to where they were before 2017 tax law, absolutely. We not only do that, we raise them a little higher than that. For people at the very highest income levels, I'm talking about the top 0.01%, we actually go up to a top marginal rate of 48%. On the corporate side, we go from, as you know, we went from 35 to 21. We take it back up to 25, 21 to 25, but we allow people to expense all investment spending. On capital gains, we debated whether to tax them like ordinary income, but because of the risk factor you mentioned, and also because they are not adjusted for inflation, and there are all kinds of administrative issues, we decided that the better thing to do was to simply raise the basis for them at depth. So those of you who don't know, Tony's looking confused. If you die and leave a lot of money to your children, the basis for what they are going to pay taxes on is the value of the stocks they inherit when you die, not the value of the stocks when you bought them. So the portion of the capital gains that they may have gotten from the time that you bought the stock to the time that you die, all of that is forgiven. It's not taxed at all. And that turns out to be, in terms of money, in terms of revenue, a huge, huge loophole. Sorry to get a little technical there, but on this having a stake in the system because everybody pays taxes, I kind of like that argument as well. But then I think, well, everybody's paying payroll taxes. And the middle class, particularly the lower middle class, people below the median, they tend to pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. So I kind of feel like we still have a stake in the system. But, you know, it's a good argument that you make about that.
But payroll taxes are based in part, in part on the idea that you will get a benefit as a result of paying those taxes.
Right.
It doesn't work exactly that way, but that still permeates people's thinking.
It sure does. I found some data recently that really shocked me on the proportion of Americans who believe that Medicare is not a government program, that it's some kind of private entity that they pay into or pay for, like a private insurance company. 40% of Americans think that Medicare is not a government program.
Well, I was thinking of Social Security, though. You know, people pay into that and then they get benefits later. The money that they pay in really isn't held and paid back to them later, but it's still thought of
They think it is. Yeah, no, I get it.
as social insurance.
I totally agree with you. I wasn't trying to debate your point at all. It's quite true.
Do you want to?
Well, since nobody else is jumping in, I really appreciate the discussion of policies, and it was a great presentation, and I agree with all of it. However, in some ways, it's just rearranging things that have been out there for a long time, and it's not addressing the most fundamental problem that I see. I'm worried about democracy, and I don't think that the reason democracy is failing is because we don't have childcare and annual leave. It's failing because our citizens are misinformed and emotional and divided and not thinking very well. And it's always been thought that democracy is only as good as the quality of the citizens, and the quality is not good. This was brought home to me as a slap in the face when on election day in 2016, I encountered a woman my age in an affluent suburb who threw up at me the Comet pizza scandal,
Oh, yes, I do know about Pizzagate, yeah.
I'd never heard of because I'd never heard of InfoWars and these things, but it's gotten worse. We have people that live in information silos,
Deserts.
talk to each other, and they don't know how to distinguish fact from paranoia, and they don't know how to reason. And if we don't solve that problem, it's not, that's what will kill democracy, because democracy will not work well without informed, involved citizens. And we are so far from that I think that's got to be the prime priority.
That was a fabulous statement, and I don't disagree with a word of it. And so, guilty as charged. Why did we not say more about that? In the chapter on respect, we treat that at some level, not in the depth that you might want, or not, because I don't know what the solution is, frankly. But
it's Russian-based. It's Russian-based. All of this stuff, this Antifa, all of this, Biden is, losing his mind and he's senile. It's all Russian-based.
Saying it's Russians is part of the problem.
Yeah. Sorry.
Well, I want to try to address Leon Ellsworth's issue here as best I can, and admit that I agree with him and that I don't have any magic solutions. Now, we talk about all the usual institutional reforms that are needed. Get money out of politics, get rid of gerrymandering, have the reform the Electoral College through an interstate compact, move to ranked choice voting. I mean, I'm not going to bore you with all that, but the political scientists have written a lot about that, and I think there's a growing consensus that we do need those institutional changes. That's not going to solve the problem that I think you rightly focused on, which is the public isn't well educated enough. Social media is having a toxic effect, and there are bad actors out there that are trying to divide us. So we do talk a little bit about some of that, but this book is not the right book to read for a solution to those problems, which I very much agree are real, and I think in the long term have got to relate to education and to other institutional changes, as well as, just all of us learning to value democracy more and caring about it enough to do what you need to do to be an informed citizen. I'll give you a small example of one thing we do recommend. We recommend that every high school student be required to attend a immigration ceremony, where you get your citizenship. Because we think too many young people don't understand what it means to be an American citizen. They don't understand how much value it has to people who come here from other countries. and how hard they work to get it and what they have to learn, by the way. Every high school student, we want them to take the same test that immigrants have to take to become a U.S. citizen. It's quite a hard test, I'm told. I've not taken it myself. Now, that's a small thing. Another thing we suggest, based on the book of one of our former colleagues, is that every high school student learn how to debate, including debating the other side of the issue that they're on. So they learn to put themselves in somebody else's shoes and learn how to use facts and logic and reasoning, as you put it, to come to a conclusion. So those are small steps, and I think you're right that we've got a serious problem in this country.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody on this call will argue with that. Marie has been waiting very patiently. So I think Marie will probably be our last question for now. Although I know Richard also had a question. Richard, if you want, you can go after Marie. We'll let you be last.
I'll see if I need it. Maybe Marie will ask it.
Okay, thank you. Marie?
Yes, are you listening? Oh,
Yes.
okay. Just to go on to what you were saying, I've been reading a book about the Trump voters. It's called Strangers in Their Own Land. And
I know it well.
Yeah, and it was very enlightening for me. They just speak of a group of people living in Louisiana, which is a very polluted area. And most of the people in the area are against regulation from the oil industry. So it seems that a lot of the people, for instance, who vote for Trump, it's emotional. It's because of something in their life. It is not something rational. I mean, those people should not be against the regulation for the oil industry, which is destroying their life, but that's the way it is. So it's very difficult to go against that.
Well, you're so right. I know that book well, and my book, The Forgotten Americans, has a lot of that same material in it. The way I would put what you just said is they have cultural anxieties that are trumping, no pun intended, their economic anxieties. They feel like some way of life is being lost. Mm-hmm. They are resentful of immigrants. They are resentful of the fact that they see women and minorities and people who are LGBTQ cutting in line to get the American dream. Do you remember her metaphor about people climbing a hill or a mountain and feeling like they're standing in line and that a lot of other people are cutting in front of them? Those are resentments against people who are different than you are. And there's a lot of that. So,
Absolutely. Richard, I don't know if that was your question. I think not. So I'm going to invite you to be our last question.
Thank you very much. My question has to do with a subject that Ed brought up to the floor and then Leon extrapolated on a little bit, and that's how we get people to connect with our government. And I think your proposal that April 15th be for many people in this country, but I guess the great majority, just another day in spring, loses something, because we need to increase ways of people becoming involved with our government. And if you have somebody who's making $22,000 a year and falls in the category of somebody living in poverty, if they pay $5 a year and they fill out a simple form, at least they pay taxes. And they're involved in their government. And when they're involved in their government, they pay a little more attention to how the government spends its money. I mean, the Greeks decided democracy was going to be a failure because eventually the people would become disenchanted with their government and they would just want more and more, and they would empty the coffers of the government, and the government with democracy would fail. We do have a democracy. We have to be careful for that. And I think we get more people to participate if we don't just give them a free ride, but if we just say, look, pay a little. So instead of having a 20% or 22% tax bracket for those people that make from $0 to X number of dollars, let's have some 5% tax brackets. Let's have some 3% tax brackets. So everybody pays and everybody starts thinking about our government. If we start people thinking about the government, if more people get involved in more of the decisions our government makes about spending money, I think we'll get a more responsible electorate, and that would help a lot. And I don't know if that goes to what you were saying, Ed, or what Leon was trying to get to with getting more people to think about government, but maybe it does, and that goes against your idea of lowering the taxes for the whole middle class.
So that's really interesting that several of you have reacted with that comment. I will take that back and mull it over, because I think it's a perfectly good and legitimate argument, and we need to think about it. One of the things we do talk about that's related is we talk about what we call citizens' juries. My co-author has had experience with them in the UK, where they've actually had them. And this is the idea of, just like a legal jury, you pull together, let's say, 12 people or whatever number, and you give them a certain amount of information, and you make experts available to them, but you then ask them to debate and decide on what a policy should look like. And I don't know if that would work, but it was one of our attempts to find a way to get people better connected to their government. But your arguments about the tax, reducing taxes on the middle class is a good one.
Thank you. And thank you for tonight, too.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very, very much, Bill. I know, I usually try and cut these programs at an hour. And the fact that we've gone an hour and 15 minutes is to your credit, because certainly people found it interesting and had really good questions based on what you shared with us. You've given us a lot to think about. I know the conversations will continue. I know I'm looking forward to hearing more from my members and what they think, and as well as others who have joined us this evening. So I thank you for your time. I thank you for being a founding member of Georgetown Village, and for being involved. It's really important. I think the work you are doing is tremendously important, and we thank you for that as well.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you all for participating. I enjoyed your comments. You're obviously a very well-read and thoughtful group, so that's fun for me. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Excellent. Everybody stay well. And our next talk is in 2 weeks, and we hope you will join us again. And I look forward to seeing you back. So please check our website and come back for more programming.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lynn.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.